start the next seif in the Rav Shulchan Aruch. Edim shechasmu al hashtar. Yeah. Oh, why is it not working? That's a good question. Let's double check it. You know, let's study your lesson. So you have to know what could have been done.
Is the rabbi gone?
The rabbi's checking the technology because they can't see the screen in the room.
Do you hear the rabbi?
The rabbi's here. We're just checking the connections on the screen in the room. Just stand by, guys.
All right, let me unplug it from my end. Plug it in again. Ah, and here we are. There we go. Okay, now everyone can see. Sorry for the delay. Edim shechasmu al hashtar, v'achar kach nisraf hashtar bifnehem o shenikra ba'ones o shenimchak. Witnesses signed on a shtar, and then in their presence, the shtar was burned. Let's say it was in a fire, or it was accidentally torn, or it was erased. Let's say it fell in water and the ink was smudged. Bein la'alter, bein la'achar zman. And whether this happened immediately after it was written, or if it happened a week later, or a month later, whatever. And so what does the creditor ask of them? He says, guys, you saw what happened, that my documents were caught in a fire. The warehouse burnt down. I need you to write me a new promissory note because my promissory note was in that warehouse. So harei elu lo yichtavu v'yitnu lo shalom midas halova. They may not write a new promissory note without the consent of the debtor. Okay, ki lo asan halova shluchim elo lichtov shtar echad v'chavar asu shlichutam. Because even if they had originally written the promissory note with the debtor's consent, he only authorized them to write one promissory note. He didn't authorize them to write multiple promissory notes. They've already fulfilled their authorized function. Aval imlo asu adayin shlichusam. But let's say they have not yet fulfilled their proxyship, their authorized function. Kagon shelo hispik hasheni lachtom ad shenimchak hashtar. So let's say, for example, they're in the process of writing it, and the second witness hasn't yet signed the note. And then all of a sudden, and they're on a yacht, and all of a sudden a big wave comes along and washes over the shtar. Okay, onikra, or it gets torn, something happens. They're on a safari, and a chimpanzee comes and grabs the shtar and tears it up. Oh, afilu, have to be a little colorful to wake us up. Oh, afilu chasmu shenehem. Or let's say they'd already signed the promissory note, but it turns out that there's a mistake. let's say the amount of money owed is mistaken. They didn't put in, or they put in 1 0 too many, or they wrote the wrong date, or they messed up the name of the lova or the malva, the debtor or the creditor, v'chol kayotze bahem, and any other kind of example of where the shtar has not yet been completed in its correct form, midavarim sheim tos, in any kind of error, bevadai o sheshachachu lichtov b'shtar eza tanai. In other words, if it's definitely an error, it has to be a definite error. If it's just a so-so error, then you can't use this heter. O sheshachachu lichtov b'shtar eza tanai shahaya b'neihem. Or let's say they neglected to write in the original note a certain condition that had already been agreed upon. In other words, they had witnessed the party saying that you have 30 days to pay back the debt unless, and then there's another condition, unless your business deal takes more time, in which I will extend you another 30 days with which to pay it back. So, and they forgot to put that part in. And that's really an important part of the shtar, such as trustworthiness and so forth. In all of those situations, they are allowed to rewrite the original promissory note even without the lova present. Because in that situation, the original note that they wrote was not written correctly. So I guess they would have to destroy the first note entirely, and then they could start all over again. So the difference between the first part of this halacha and the second part of this halacha is that in the first part, they've completely written a perfectly formed note and it gets destroyed. So in that situation, they have to consult with the lova and get his consent before they can write a second note. In the second case, the first note was incorrectly written, and so they didn't fulfill their original proxyship that was dispatched to them by the debtor, and therefore, even without the debtor's consent, they can say, well, he still authorized us to write a legitimate promissory note, which we failed to do the first time, so we are allowed to do it even without his express authorization, because it's considered as if the original authorization covers this action as well. Okay? Yeah. That's right. Yeah. Well, it's a group. They are working as a group. Yeah. Right. It's considered that neither have effectively fulfilled their proxyship. Okay. That's, I guess, the argument that you would make, right? Okay. So let's take a look at the Imrei Yaakov. Kuf Samech Zayin, Lo Yichtavu V'yitnu. In a situation where the contract got destroyed, they should not rewrite it without the consent of the debtor. Das harosh v'hatur deha'edim atzmam yecholim lichtov afilu below tzivoy halo v'mizman hasheni. Of course, unsurprisingly, this is a machlokes, and the opinion of the Rosh and the Tur is that when the original shtar is destroyed, the edim can rewrite it without the express permission of the lova. He says, and they can even write that it wasn't the original transaction was enacted on a date, which is, let's say, 2 weeks ago, whenever the original transaction occurred. Avol dasa Rambam v'chein or the kama perushim b'shulchan aruch kedasa Ravkan. But the opinion of the Rambam and many commentaries in the Shulchan Aruch is to not permit it, and that's what the Rav Shulchan Aruch is representing in this halacha. Okay. Uchavar asu shlichusan. If they have already fulfilled their proxyship, they can't just write a new note without a new authorization, a second authorization from the lova. Aval heim holchem lebeisnu meidim. So the question is, what remedy does a creditor have in a situation where the original promissory note has been destroyed and the debtor does not authorize the writing of a new promissory note. He says, no, I'm not interested. This was an act of God, and I will rely on the act of God to whatever God wants. You know, he became religious. Yeah. So, what does the creditor have any recourse at all? So the answer is yes, he has recourse, but he has to go to Beis Din. The creditor will bring the witnesses to Beis Din, and then the Beis Din will write the promissory note. But the Eidim, we're just talking about the Eidim now. The Eidim are not authorized to write it because they would need permission from both parties. The Beis Din, however, does not need the authorization of both parties as long as the witnesses testify what happened. So then the Beis Din can write a new note. They might summon him. We're going to learn it. We're going to learn a halacha in the next sif what the Beis Din's responsibility is. We'll see, but I would assume that they would have to send him a summons. If he refuses to show, then they might be able to do it in absentia. Okay. That's a good question. You would certainly need the first Eidim to testify to the Beis Din as to whether when you write up the second promissory note, do they have to be the same Eidim? That I don't know. We'll see. Okay. Ta'us b'sacha ma'os, but if the original note was malformed, it was written incorrectly, so then the witnesses can write a second one. Sofer shakas, and an example is if the wrong amount was written in. Okay, so Sofer shakas of shtar, the kas of mana b'makom masayim. If let's say you hire a scribe and he fills in the wrong amount in the shtar, instead of writing 200, he only writes 100. Pater, the lo havi elagrama b'nezikin. So what is the liability of the scribe? Now this is an interesting question. You have you have a lawyer. In our case, it would be a lawyer. He's drafting papers. He's drafting a promissory note or some kind of debt contract, which creates debt. And he accidentally puts in the wrong amount. And the witness sign and trust the lawyer and everything. And as a result, I can't collect the full amount because, unfortunately, Marvin, he was a little bit on the, so he put in the wrong amount. So can I sue Marvin? What's that? That's right. Okay. Right. So would that argument hold up in court, do you think? Or would the court have you create partial liability? Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Go to the law society to the insurance company. The insurance company would probably send in a repair team before the case, or if they couldn't repair it and fix it all up, and they either pay the insurance or not. So usually there's insurance, professional liability insurance involved. But if they choose to take it to court, then yeah, it's probably at fault.
So halachically, you would not be at fault. In other words, you'd be at fault, but it would be a fault that we could not act upon in Beis Din, because it's what's called the grama b'nezik, and it's causative damage. It's not direct damage. So bahani mili kisheta'a kinal, the low cost of masha yitzarach the low asa klum. He says that's only when the scribe wrote in the wrong amount, so he didn't write what he was supposed to. Avalim ta'a because of masayim b'makom mana. The yafsid al yideze as halove, but what if he writes too much? In other words, when he writes less than the amount he was supposed to write, it's a crime of passivity. It's considered a crime of passivity because he's denying the creditor the ability to collect the full amount. Everything is being It's passive. But what if he writes in too much? So allowing the creditor to collect twice the amount that he was normally, that the debt was for. So he's causing an active damage to the debtor. So yesh omrim dechayev dehavale kimafsido biyadayim. So some say that he would be liable in that situation because he's more causing a direct source. He's a direct source of damage. Okay, od kasvu al poskim. Poskim also discussed Tanishahu mimuna betur pakid lirshom haschorot. Let's say you have someone who is a broker, I guess you would call him, and he's supposed to do an inventory on merchandise. Maybe it's not. Maybe it's like a foreman. And maybe maybe he's just working in a warehouse. He's in charge of doing inventory in the warehouse. And he ends up undercounting the amount of stock of in the inventory. And as a result of counting too little inventory, let's say the guy sells the inventory based on this fellow's count and undersells it because he forgot an entire row of inventory. And as a result, when the guy sold the contents of the warehouse, he sold it for, let's say, 20% less of its value because the guy didn't count the proper amount. So in that situation, the employee who was hired to count inventory is going to be liable. Why? Because he's considered a shomer. He's a guardian over another person's property, and he's being paid, so he's a shomer sachar, and he's liable even for causative damage in this situation, because this is clearly a negligent act. And this was discussed in a long ago chapter 8. We're now in chapter 13. So we discussed this a long time ago when we talked about the laws of shomerim, of guardians of other people's property. Okay, you can find it in our recordings. Go for it. Okay, tos bevadai. The only way that you can use this argument that if the contract was malformed, then the Edom can rewrite it without the authorization of the debtor is only if it was a clear and unambiguous mistake. Okay. Ken kasav hashach. This is just a quote from the Shach. The dafka vaday tos of al safek lo. That it has to be a clear and unambiguous mistake. If, however, it's not clear whether the way the shtar currently is written is mistaken or not, so then you're not allowed to rewrite it without the authorization of the love. The shema shtar zeh kosher uchavar asa shlichusin, because the argument would be that maybe the shtar is kosher and they've already fulfilled their proxyship. V'aktzos hachoshen poligolov. The Ktsos disagrees, and he says that even if there's a mistake in the shtar that's questionable, they're still allowed to rewrite it, because at the end of the day, the Lova would want them to rewrite it because they haven't fulfilled by writing something that's unambiguously kosher. And the reason is because since there's a questionable error in the shtar, it disallows the creditor from being able to use it properly. Because even many times when there's a suffix, we say motze mechavero olav haraya. If you want to be able to collect from someone else, you have to bring absolute proof. If there's even a suffix, if there's even a question whether this contract is written correctly, then the other party could claim, well, if there's a suffix, how can you allow this guy to collect with a questionable instrument? So therefore, the Ktsos' argument is that even if there's a questionable error in the shtar, they're allowed to rewrite it. Okay. Let's see. What's the next one? Okay, now we're going on to the next sif. We accidentally forgot to put in the letter lamed tes over here. Okay, let's go on to the next halacha. Okay, va'afilu im asu kvar shlichusam she'enam rishayim lachzor v'lichtov lo me'atzman. He says, so this is the halacha that we alluded to in the Imrei Yaakov a moment ago. Even if they've already fulfilled their proxyship, and they're not allowed to write a new shtar, even if the first shtar was destroyed without the authorization of the debtor. But what they can do, harehem holchim lebeistin umeidim, they can testify in Beistin that so-and-so, we saw the shtar destroyed, we had written the original shtar, we were present at the transaction that created the debt, and the Beistin yichtavu lo shtar acher v'yitnu lo shelo midas halova. Then the court can go ahead and rewrite the promissory note without the consent or without the knowledge of the debtor, shebazeh koach Beistin yafeh, because in this respect, the Beistin is vested with greater power than the witnesses. And when the Beistin rewrites the document, they put in the original date, not the date of the writing of the current promissory note. And the reason why they do that is to enforce the power of the creditor to collect on encumbered property that became encumbered after the debt was created. Right? Because if they would write the present date, that might potentially cause the creditor to lose out in case the debtor had divested himself of all of his property in the interim. Okay? Aval kisha'edim kosvim shelo al pi based in elamidas halove yichtavu zman sha'omdim bo ata. And this is a big difference between when the Beistin writes the promissory note or when the Eidim rewrite the promissory note. When the Eidim rewrite the promissory note, they can only put in today's date. They can't put in the original date. Ki einu yochol l'shabed nechasav lemafreya lahafsid lelukuchos shelakchu mimenu bintayim im shtar shegovim bo mehameshubadim. He says, because you can't predate a shtar, which will cause liability to people who had purchased property from the debtor, using a new instrument that was not the original instrument. In other words, even if the debtor consents to the writing of a new shtar because the first shtar got destroyed, unless this is done in Beistin, the witnesses don't have the power, even with the help of the debtor, to write a new document and predate it. Because what they're doing is they're creating a new instrument that unlawfully will collect from property that had already been purchased from other people. That that's the question. Could they write that in July of 2022, we were witness to a transaction whereby Shimon indebted his property to Reuven, and the shtar was lost, and now we're rewriting the shtar dated February 1st, 2023. Could they do that? And that seems, we'll have to see if that's allowable, because that would make the most sense. But even if they did, what the Rav Shulchan Aruch is trying to express, it seems, is that's not going to work. It's not going to work, it seems, because this instrument itself did not exist at the time when the transaction was made. And it's the instrument itself that allows the creditor to collect from encumbered property of the debtor. That's what it seems like. Well, let's just finish the halacha. Bein shu shtar chov, bein shu shtar mechir. This is true whether it's a promissory note or whether it's a bill of sale. Ve'achrayas al nechasav, whenever there is a creation of a lien on the debtor's property. The shibud shtar harishon kvar nifka b'kriyasos reipas mechikasa. And that's the argument he's making, is that when the original document was destroyed, that also destroyed the lien on the property. So even when you create a new document, you can't recreate the lien that had been created with the first document. What? but the Beis Din can't. The Beis Din have the authorization to recreate a lien, even retroactively, because they have the powers vested within them to take money from one party and give it to another, not based on the standard principles of what works in halacha. Okay, so so if we take a look at the Imrei Yaakov over here, let's see what he says. And yes, that's exactly what he writes. The principle is called Hefker Beis Din Hefker. Have you ever heard that term? Hefker Beis Din Hefker. Whatever Beis Din declares to be ownerless is ownerless. That's essentially what it means. So if the Beis Din deems it fair and proper to take money from Shimon and give it to Reuven, even though the mechanisms are not in place to do that, they can say, Shimon, you owe Reuven $100, even if, let's say, there's no documentation. But if the Beis Din detects that Shimon owes Reuven $100, they can generate that debt using this principle.
Ask the court, and but the guarantee lost or stolen.
Uh-huh.
And under the law, you have to have a guarantee in writing signed by parties and blah blah blah. So so the defense was, there's no guarantee, you can't sue me. So the courts had witnesses that said, yes, but we saw that there was a guarantee years ago. We were there. And the court accepted the testimony to say, we're satisfied there was a guarantee, even though you don't have one here in court now, but it's good enough to satisfy the statute of frauds, which there was a guarantee in writing signed. It's not here, but satisfied there was one and awarded judgment against the guarantor. Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Okay, so it's the same principle, right? But if it's done outside of Beis Din, a debtor cannot retroactively place a lien on his property, especially at the liability of some innocent third party. V'yesh omrim de'im haya shtar kinyana shekanu mehalova b'sha'asa halva. Some say that if the shtar represented a transaction, that there was a transaction made at the time of the debt, Yecholim lichtov shtar gam mizman harishon. Then the witnesses could write a new shtar, which is reflective and put in the original date. Why? He says because it wasn't the piece of paper per se that created the lien, but rather the kinyan. And so this is a very technical point. What created the lien on the debtor's property? Was it the piece of paper? Yes, if there was no kinyan. Then the signing of the piece of paper is the thing that generates the lien. If, however, in addition to the paper, there was an actual kinyan where the debtor took possession of a handkerchief and in exchange for the handkerchief generated an invisible debt or invisible lien on his property. So then the witnesses, according to some opinions, could write, without going to Beis Din, they could write a new shtar that is reflective of that. Okay, so that's in itself is a machlokas. Well, that's not always so. It's only if the word vikanina is written in the shtar. If the word vikanina is written in the shtar, then the shtar itself says that a kinyan was made. But if the word vikanina does not appear in the shtar, and it's the note itself that is the generation of the debt, so then that's okay. We'll hold it here for today. Have a wonderful Shabbos, everybody, and enjoy.